A woman abandoned at the altar is not forgotten. She is erased. The old saying whispered through Emily Carter's mind as she stood alone beneath the towering arches of the chapel, the cold seeping through the stone floor into her bones, while the final bell echoed overhead, slow and hollow, marking a wedding that would never happen. Her gloved hands tightening around a bouquet, she could no longer feel as silence stretched too long, too heavy, until the murmurs began, soft at first, like wind, slipping through cracks, then growing sharper, crueler, guests leaning toward one another with barely concealed curiosity. "He's not coming," someone breathed, and another voice followed. "Poor girl," as if pity could soften humiliation. But Emily did not move, did not lower her gaze. Her spine held straight with a dignity that felt like the last fragile thread holding her together. Even as her father stood frozen in the front pew, his face pale with shame, her mother clutching a handkerchief, as though it were the only thing keeping her from collapsing. And still no footsteps came, no door opened, only the distant creak of wood and the restless shifting of a crowd that had come for celebration and found spectacle instead. Then the chapel doors opened at last, but not for the groom, only for a young messenger whose hurried steps echoed far too loudly as he approached, his eyes refusing to meet hers as he placed a sealed letter into the trembling hands of the priest, who hesitated, just for a moment, before breaking it open, the sound of tearing paper cutting through the air like a final verdict. And when the words were spoken, quiet yet unmistakable, the meaning spread faster than any whisper ever could. He would not come. He had chosen another life, another future, leaving her standing here as nothing more than a mistake to be forgotten. A ripple of gasps moved through the pews, followed by something worse than cruelty, the subtle shift of attention, of dismissal, as if she had already become invisible, as if her existence no longer mattered now that she had been rejected. And still Emily did not cry, though her fingers loosened just enough for the bouquet to slip, petals brushing the cold stone floor in a soft, defeated fall, her breath shallow but controlled, her eyes fixed ahead as if she could outlast the moment by sheer will alone. And then, just as the silence threatened to swallow her whole, another sound broke through it, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady, deliberate, the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps crossing the stone aisle, each one measured, each one commanding attention without asking for it. Conversations faltered, heads turned, and from the shadowed back of the chapel emerged a figure no one had expected to move. Duke Alexander Whitmore, his dark coat catching the dim candlelight as he walked forward with a calm that seemed almost defiant against the chaos. His gaze fixed not on the crowd, not on the spectacle, but on her, as though the entire room had ceased to exist the moment he chose to step forward. And when he stopped before her, close enough that she could finally feel the presence of someone who saw her, truly saw her, his voice broke the silence with quiet authority, low and unwavering. "Look at me." And something in those words, simple yet undeniable, made her lift her eyes at last. And for the first time since the bells began to ring, the world shifted, just slightly, just enough to make her realize that the moment was not over yet. Emily's breath caught as his words settled between them, simple yet impossible to ignore. And for a moment she forgot the whispers, forgot the letter, forgot the hollow ache that had been threatening to pull her under, because the way he looked at her was not with pity or curiosity, but with something steady, something deliberate, as if he had already made a decision that no one else in that chapel could alter. Her fingers trembled slightly at her sides, the absence of her bouquet suddenly noticeable, as though she had shed the last fragile symbol of what this day was meant to be, and now stood with nothing but herself, exposed and uncertain. Yet he did not step back, did not hesitate, his presence filling the cold space with a quiet authority that drew every eye, every breath, every unspoken question toward them. The murmurs rose again behind her, sharper now, confused, disbelieving. "What is he doing?" someone whispered, while another voice answered in hushed disbelief. "That is the Duke," as if his title alone could explain the impossible scene unfolding before them. But Emily could not look away from him, because there was something in his gaze that felt like a hand extended into the darkness, not demanding, not forcing, but waiting. And she realized with a sudden clarity that he was giving her a choice in a moment where she had been stripped of all of them. Her voice, when it finally came, was softer than she intended, but it did not break. Your Grace, why? The question hung between them, fragile and dangerous. Because she did not ask for kindness. She did not ask for rescue. She asked for truth, and for a fraction of a second something shifted in his expression, not doubt, never doubt, but something deeper, something that spoke of a decision made long before this moment. His answer was quiet, meant only for her, yet it carried through the silence of the chapel as though the walls themselves leaned in to hear. Because you deserve to stand here without being diminished. The words were not grand, not poetic, but they struck with a force that no whispered insult could rival. And before she could respond, before she could question the weight of what he was offering, he turned slightly, just enough to face the watching crowd. His voice no longer quiet, no longer meant for her alone, but for every person who had come to witness her humiliation. There will be no scandal here today, he said, each word measured, unyielding. There will be a wedding. A ripple of shock moved through the pews. Her mother's hand pressed to her lips in disbelief, her father rising halfway, as if unsure whether to protest or hope. The priest stood frozen, caught between duty and astonishment. And still Alexander Whitmore did not falter, his hand extended toward Emily now, palm open, steady, waiting, not claiming, not commanding, but offering something that felt far more dangerous, the chance to step into a future she had not chosen yet could no longer deny was unfolding before her. The air felt thinner, every breath harder to take as the weight of the moment pressed down, and in that suspended heartbeat, Emily understood that whatever she chose next would not erase what had happened, would not undo the humiliation or the whispers or the broken promises, but it would define what came after, and slowly, with a courage that did not come from hope, but from the quiet strength she had carried all along. She lifted her hand toward his, her fingers brushing against his gloved palm, and in that single touch, the entire chapel seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see whether this was salvation or the beginning of something neither of them could yet understand. The moment her fingers settled into his palm, the world did not erupt as she had expected. It did not shatter into chaos or applause. Instead, it shifted in something far more unsettling, a deep, breathless silence that spread through the chapel like a held storm, as if every person present understood that something irreversible had just occurred. Alexander's grip was firm but not possessive, steady in a way that grounded her, anchoring her to the present when everything else still felt like it was slipping away. His thumb barely moved against the fabric of her glove, a subtle reassurance that she had not imagined this, that he was real, that this moment was real. And then he turned fully toward the altar, guiding her beside him with a quiet confidence that left no space for interruption. The priest blinked as if waking from a dream, his gaze flickering between them, uncertain. Your Grace, this is highly irregular. He began, his voice cautious, but Alexander did not release her hand, did not even glance away from the front of the chapel. So is abandoning a bride at the altar. He replied, his tone calm, yet edged with something unyielding, a truth that settled heavily into the air and silenced any further objection. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, others leaned forward, unable to look away, drawn into the gravity of what was unfolding. Emily felt every eye on her again, but it was different now, no longer dismissive, no longer pitying, but searching, questioning, trying to understand how she had gone from discarded to chosen in the span of a single breath. Her heart beat harder, not from fear alone, but from the unfamiliar weight of being seen in a way she had never expected. Her gaze lowered briefly to their joined hands, then lifted again, steady this time, as if she were stepping into a role she had not rehearsed but somehow knew she could not refuse. Her father took a hesitant step forward, his voice rough with disbelief. Emily, are you certain? The question was not one of authority but of fragile hope, and she turned just enough to meet his eyes, offering a small, quiet nod that carried more strength than any declaration, because certainty was not what she felt, but resolve was, and sometimes that was enough. The priest cleared his throat, still uncertain but bound by the presence of a duke whose will carried weight beyond custom. Very well, he said slowly, adjusting the open book before him as if the act could restore order to a moment that defied it. We shall proceed. The words seemed to echo longer than they should have, marking the beginning of something no one in that room had anticipated. The candles flickered as a draft moved through the chapel, casting shifting shadows across the stone walls. And for a brief second, Emily wondered if this was how fate felt, not grand or obvious, but quiet, unexpected, and impossible to reverse once it had begun. Alexander's voice came again, softer now, meant only for her. You can still step back, he said, giving her one final chance. One final door out of a path neither of them fully understood. And she looked at him, truly looked this time, at the calm strength in his expression, at the absence of hesitation, at the strange, unwavering certainty that seemed to surround him, and something within her, something that had refused to break even when everything else had, answered before doubt could take hold. No, she said, her voice low but steady. I will not. And as the priest began to speak the familiar words that had once belonged to a different future, the chapel that had witnessed her humiliation now bore witness to something else entirely, something far more dangerous than shame, the quiet beginning of a choice that would change everything. The priest's voice carried through the chapel, steady but laced with an uncertainty that matched the tension in the air, each word of the ceremony sounding both familiar and entirely out of place as it bound two people who had not come here together. Emily felt the weight of every syllable settle over her shoulders like an invisible mantle, heavier than her gown, heavier than the expectations that had once guided her steps. Yet she did not falter. Her hand remained in Alexander's, the warmth of his presence cutting through the lingering chill that clung to the stone walls. She became aware of the way the candlelight flickered against his profile, sharp and composed, as though he had stepped into this moment without hesitation and would carry it forward regardless of what the world thought. The murmurs had not disappeared. They had only softened, shifting into something more restrained, more cautious, as if even the most curious voices understood that they were witnessing a line being drawn that should not be crossed lightly. Her mother's quiet sob had turned into a fragile silence. Her father stood straighter now, his earlier shame replaced with a guarded dignity that mirrored her own. And still the ceremony continued, each vow spoken like a quiet defiance against what had nearly destroyed her only minutes before. When it was her turn to speak, her voice did not tremble as she had feared it might. Instead, it carried a calm that surprised even her. As if the act of choosing had given her a strength she had not known she possessed, she did not speak of love, because love had not brought her here. She spoke of commitment, of standing, of remaining when it would have been easier to disappear. And as the final words approached, the chapel seemed to lean inward once more, waiting for the moment that would seal what had begun in shock and disbelief. The priest paused, glancing between them as if seeking one last sign of hesitation. But there was none. Alexander's gaze never wavered from hers. And when he spoke his vow, it was quiet, almost private despite the crowded room. I will not let you stand alone again. The simplicity of it struck deeper than any elaborate promise could have, because it was not a declaration for the audience. It was a truth offered directly to her, something steady in a world that had proven how quickly it could turn. The words settled into her chest, not as comfort exactly, but as something close, something she could hold on to even as uncertainty stretched before her. The final blessing was given, the words spoken that marked them, as bound in a way no one could undo. And for a brief second, nothing happened, no applause, no movement, only a suspended silence as if the entire chapel needed a moment to understand what had just taken place. And then, slowly, the world resumed, a rustle of fabric, a shift of breath, the quiet acknowledgement that what had begun as humiliation had ended in something no one had anticipated. Alexander released her hand only long enough to offer his arm, the gesture formal, yet carrying a subtle reassurance, and she placed her hand there without hesitation, feeling the solid strength beneath the fabric of his sleeve as he guided her to turn, to face the long aisle that had once seemed like a path of judgment, and now stretched before them as something entirely different. The doors at the far end stood closed, the cold light from outside barely visible through the narrow glass panes. And as they began to walk forward together, each step echoed softly against the stone, no longer the sound of isolation but of something shared, something chosen, yet beneath the steady rhythm of their movement, a quiet question lingered in the space between them, unspoken but undeniable, not whether this marriage would change her life, but why he had chosen to change it at all, and whether the answer would bring her peace, or unravel everything she thought she understood. The heavy chapel doors opened with a low, echoing groan, and a rush of cold air swept inside as Emily stepped forward beside Alexander. The world beyond the threshold waiting in stark contrast to the dim, flickering shadows they left behind. Daylight stretched across the stone steps like a pale invitation, but it did not feel warm, not yet. It felt uncertain, like everything else that had unfolded within the last hour. The gathered guests parted instinctively as they passed, their whispers following in hushed waves, no longer sharp with mockery but thick with curiosity, confusion, and something dangerously close to respect. Emily kept her gaze forward, her posture unchanged, though she could feel the weight of every glance pressing against her back, measuring, questioning, trying to reconcile the girl who had been abandoned with the woman who now walked beside a duke, her hand resting lightly on his arm, steady not because she felt steady but because she refused to appear. Otherwise, each step down the stone staircase sounded louder in the open air, the rhythm grounding her as the crisp wind brushed against her face, lifting a loose strand of her hair, carrying with it the distant scent of winter and something else she could not quite name, something like possibility. The carriage stood waiting at the foot of the steps, dark and imposing, its polished surface reflecting the pale sky above, a silent promise of departure, of leaving behind the place where everything had nearly fallen apart. Alexander paused just before they reached it, his hand briefly tightening beneath hers, not enough to draw attention, but enough for her to notice, to realize that even he, composed as he seemed, was aware of the magnitude of what they had done. He turned slightly toward her, his voice low enough that only she could hear. This will change everything. It was not a warning, not quite, but it carried the weight of truth, and Emily met his gaze without hesitation, her answer just as quiet, just as steady. It already has. There was no fear in her voice, not because fear was absent, but because she had already faced the worst of it inside those walls, and whatever came next could not erase the choice she had made. His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if her words had confirmed something he needed to know. And then he stepped forward, opening the carriage door himself rather than allowing a servant to do it. The gesture simple but deliberate, an acknowledgement that this was not a performance, not a transaction carried out for appearance alone. Emily hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping inside, the interior dim and lined with dark velvet, a stark contrast to the cold brightness outside. As she settled onto the seat, the reality of the enclosed space pressed in around her, quieter, more intimate, and suddenly there were no whispers, no watching eyes, only the steady sound of the door closing and the soft shift of the carriage as Alexander followed, taking his place opposite her. For the first time since he had spoken in the chapel, there was nothing to distract from the space between them, no audience, no ceremony, no expectations to guide their roles, only silence, stretching just long enough to become something that needed to be broken. Emily folded her hands in her lap, her gaze lifting to meet his, searching now not for reassurance but for understanding. "Why me?" she asked again, the question no longer fragile but firm, because whatever this was, whatever they had begun, she needed more than gestures, more than declarations spoken in a moment of shock. She needed truth. Alexander did not look away, did not hesitate. But for the first time, something deeper moved behind his composed expression, something guarded, something that suggested the answer was not simple. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet gravity that seemed to shift the very air between them. "Because you were not meant to be discarded," he said, and though the words should have felt like kindness, there was something else beneath them, something unspoken, something that hinted this was not the beginning of a story, but the continuation of one she had never known she was part of. The carriage lurched forward with a slow, deliberate motion, the sound of wheels grinding against gravel breaking the fragile silence that had settled between them. And with each passing second, the chapel, the whispers, the humiliation began to fade into the distance behind them. Yet the weight of it lingered in the air inside the carriage, thick and unspoken. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer after his answer, the words echoing in her mind not as comfort but as a puzzle, because there was something unfinished in the way he said it, something that suggested he knew more than he had revealed. Her fingers tightened slightly in her lap as she leaned back against the seat, the dark velvet cool against her spine. "That is not an answer," she said quietly, her voice steady but edged with a firmness that had only grown stronger since the moment he stepped into the aisle. She was no longer the girl waiting to be chosen. She had already made her choice, and now she demanded truth in return. Alexander did not immediately respond, his gaze shifting briefly to the window as the passing landscape blurred into muted shades of gray and winter light, his reflection faintly visible in the glass, composed, controlled, but not untouched, as if the events of the morning had stirred something he had long kept buried. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, more measured. "It is the only answer I can give you, for now." The pause between his words was deliberate, not evasive but careful, as though he were choosing which truths could be spoken and which must remain hidden. Emily studied him, searching for hesitation, for doubt, for any sign that this had been an impulsive act driven by pride or obligation. But she found none, only that same quiet certainty that had drawn him forward in the chapel, and something else, something more difficult to define, a restraint that hinted at a deeper story waiting just beyond reach. The carriage turned sharply, the movement pulling her attention briefly to the outside, the familiar roads of town slipping away, replaced by longer stretches of open land, bare trees standing like silent witnesses beneath the pale sky. She realized then with a sudden clarity that there was no return to what had been, no path back to the life she had known that morning. And yet, instead of fear, she felt something steadier settling in its place, a quiet resolve that matched the rhythm of the carriage wheels beneath them. "You knew," she said suddenly, her eyes returning to him with renewed focus, the realization forming as she spoke it aloud. "You knew he would not come." The statement hung between them, sharp and undeniable, and for the first time, Alexander did not answer immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with confirmation, and when he finally met her gaze again, there was no denial in his expression, only acknowledgement. "I suspected," he corrected, though the difference felt smaller than the words suggested. Emily's breath caught, not in shock, but in understanding, pieces falling into place with unsettling clarity. "And you came anyway," she continued, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful than accusing. He inclined his head slightly. "I do not leave matters to chance when they concern people who cannot afford to lose." The words were precise, controlled, yet they carried a weight that reached far beyond the moment. Emily held on to them, turning them over in her mind, because they revealed something essential, something that had nothing to do with impulse or spectacle. This had not been a sudden decision made in the heat of humiliation. It had been calculated, considered, perhaps even planned, and that realization did not frighten her as much as it should have. Instead, it sparked something else, a cautious curiosity. Then this, she gestured lightly between them. The space that now bound their futures together was never just about today. Alexander's gaze did not waver. "No," he said simply, and the single word carried more truth than any explanation could. The carriage continued forward, steady and unrelenting, as if drawn by a path already set long before either of them had stepped into it. And in that quiet, enclosed space, Emily understood that whatever had begun in that cold chapel was not an accident of circumstance, but the opening move in a story she had not yet been told. The carriage rolled on in steady silence, the rhythm of the wheels against the road becoming a quiet, relentless pulse that filled the space between them, and Emily felt the weight of his last words settle deeper with every passing second. No, not an accident, not a moment of impulse, but something deliberate, something that had been set in motion long before she had stepped into that chapel. Her gaze drifted briefly to the window again, watching as the familiar edges of town disappeared. Entirely now, replaced by wide stretches of winter fields and distant hills softened by a pale sky. The world felt larger here, emptier, as though she had crossed some invisible boundary and could no longer return. Her reflection faintly appeared in the glass, a bride still dressed in white, but no longer the same woman who had stood waiting for someone who never came. She turned back to him slowly, her voice quieter now, but more precise. Then tell me what I was meant to lose. The question was not bitter, not accusatory, but it carried a clarity that demanded more than partial truths. Because if he had known, if he had planned, then he had understood the stakes in a way she had not, and she refused to remain in the dark any longer. Alexander did not immediately answer, his gaze lowering briefly as though considering the weight of her question, not avoiding it, but measuring it. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a tone that was different from before, less guarded, but more serious. Your name, he said. The simplicity of it struck harder than she expected, because she knew exactly what he meant: reputation, standing, the quiet currency that determined a woman's place in society. All of it had been on the verge of collapse the moment that letter had been read aloud. Her fingers tightened again, not in fear, but in recognition. And you think this fixes that? She asked, her eyes searching his, not for reassurance, but for honesty. He met her gaze without hesitation. It changes the narrative, he replied, and there was something unmistakably strategic in his words now, something that revealed the depth of his understanding. You are no longer the woman who was abandoned, he continued, his tone steady. You are the Duchess who was chosen. The distinction hung between them, sharp and undeniable, and Emily felt its weight, not as comfort, but as transformation, because he was right. The story had shifted, the whispers would follow, but they would no longer define her in the same way. And yet, even as she recognized the truth in his words, something within her resisted the simplicity of it. And that is enough for you, she said softly, not quite a question, more an observation. Alexander's expression did not change, but something deeper moved behind it, something that suggested the answer was not as simple as it appeared. No, he said after a moment, and the quiet certainty of that single word caught her attention more than anything else he had said so far. The carriage slowed slightly as it approached a long, winding road lined with tall, bare trees, their branches stretching overhead like silent arches, and Emily felt the shift in direction not just in the movement of the wheels, but in the conversation itself. Then what is it for? She asked, her voice lower now, almost cautious, because she could sense that whatever answer followed would carry more weight than anything he had revealed so far. Alexander leaned back slightly, his gaze returning to her with a steadiness that felt almost unyielding. Because some things should not be allowed to happen, he said, and though the words sounded simple, there was a depth beneath them that spoke of something personal, something rooted in a past he had not yet shared. Emily held his gaze, the silence stretching between them once more, but this time it was different, not empty, not uncertain, but charged with the understanding that she had stepped into something far more complex than a marriage of convenience. And as the carriage turned onto the long drive that led toward a distant estate barely visible through the trees, she realized that whatever truth he was holding back was not just about her. It was about him, and whatever had shaped his decision to step forward in that chapel was still waiting to be revealed. The carriage slowed as the long drive curved through rows of towering trees, their bare branches arching overhead, like silent witnesses to every arrival and every secret carried within these grounds. And as the estate finally came into view, Emily felt something shift deep within her, not fear exactly, but an awareness that whatever lay ahead was far beyond anything she had known before. The house rose from the winter landscape with a quiet authority, all stone and shadow, its windows reflecting the pale sky like watchful eyes. It was not welcoming, not warm, but it was undeniable, a place built on history, on power, on stories that had been lived and buried long before she stepped into them. The carriage came to a smooth halt before the grand entrance, the sound of hooves settling against the frozen ground breaking the stillness. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the silence stretching again, not uncertain this time, but heavy with transition, as though crossing the threshold of that carriage would mark the true beginning of whatever this was between them. Alexander reached for the door, himself once more, opening it with the same deliberate ease he had shown before, stepping out first before turning back toward her, his hand extended, waiting, steady, offering, not commanding. Emily hesitated only for a breath before placing her hand in his, allowing him to guide her down, her boots meeting the cold stone with a quiet firmness that surprised even her. She lifted her gaze, taking in the full scale of the estate now that she stood before it, the tall columns, the dark wood doors, the stillness that seemed to linger in the very air, and somewhere in the distance, a single window flickered with candlelight, a small, almost hidden warmth in an otherwise imposing place. The front doors opened before they could reach them, a line of staff already waiting inside, their posture precise, their expressions carefully neutral, yet there was no mistaking the curiosity behind their composed faces. Because word had traveled faster than any carriage could, they knew, they all knew, what had happened, what he had done, and what it meant for the woman now standing at his side. Emily felt the weight of their attention immediately, but she did not shrink from it. Her chin lifted slightly, her steps measured as she walked beside him into the grand hall. The warmth inside wrapped around her like a quiet contrast to the cold outside, but it did not soften the moment. It sharpened it, because here, there was no crowd to distract, no whispers to blur the edges, only the undeniable reality of where she now stood. A servant stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Welcome home, Your Grace." The words were directed to Alexander, but the subtle glance that followed rested briefly on Emily, acknowledging her presence in a way that was both respectful and questioning, because her place here had been decided in a single moment that no one had anticipated. Alexander inclined his head once, his voice calm, unquestioned. "Prepare the West Wing," he said. Then after a brief pause, his gaze shifted toward Emily, not asking, not uncertain, but including her in the statement. For the Duchess, the title settled into the room like a quiet declaration, and Emily felt it land within her just as heavily, not as a comfort, not yet, but as a truth she could no longer ignore. The staff moved immediately, the machinery of the household adjusting around her without hesitation, because this was not a place that questioned decisions, it adapted to them. And as the doors closed behind her, sealing out the last traces of the world she had left behind, Emily realized with a clarity that settled deep in her chest that whatever answers she sought, whatever truth lay behind his actions, it was not waiting out there in the past. It was here, within these walls, hidden in the silence of this house, and in the man who had brought her into it. The grand hall seemed to absorb every sound as Emily stepped further inside. The echo of her footsteps softened by thick rugs and polished stone. The air warmer here, but no less heavy, as if the walls themselves held on to something unspoken, something that had lingered long before her arrival. She became aware of the subtle details now, the way the chandeliers cast a muted golden light across dark wood panels, the faint scent of polished oak and distant fireplaces, the quiet precision with which the staff moved around them, never hurried, never uncertain, yet always aware, always watching. She felt it in the way their eyes flickered toward her and then away, careful not to linger too long, as though trying to understand how she fit into a place that had not been prepared for her. Alexander did not slow, did not pause, his presence cutting a clear path through the space as he guided her toward a sweeping staircase that curved upward into shadow, his voice calm, carrying without effort. "You will have everything you need." The words sounded simple, but they carried a quiet finality, as if he had already arranged every detail before she had even considered what she might require. Emily followed beside him, her hand no longer resting on his arm, but still close enough to feel the warmth of his presence. The distance between them subtle, yet noticeable now that the moment of ceremony had passed. "That is not what I need," she replied softly, her voice steady but thoughtful, and for the first time since they had entered, he slowed slightly, not stopping, but acknowledging her words in the only way he allowed himself to. With attention rather than interruption, they reached the base of the staircase, and as they began to ascend, the world below seemed to fall away, the quiet murmur of the hall fading into a distant hum, replaced by the softer, more intimate silence of the upper floors. Emily's gaze drifted along the walls, noticing portraits lining the corridor above, faces captured in oil and shadow, men and women who had stood where she now walked, their expressions composed, distant, as if they had long since accepted whatever roles had been given to them. She wondered, briefly, if any of them had ever stood here by choice, or if they too had been drawn into lives they had not expected. "Then tell me what you need," Alexander said at last, his voice quieter now, not distant, but closer, more focused, and she turned to him, the question settling between them like something fragile, something that could not be answered lightly. "The truth," she said simply, "because anything less would not hold. Not here, not in a place where everything else felt so carefully constructed." He stopped then, just short of the landing, the movement subtle but significant, his gaze meeting hers fully for the first time since they had entered the house. And in that moment, the distance between them shifted again, not physical, but something deeper, something that made the silence feel heavier, more deliberate. "You will have it," he said after a pause, his voice steady but measured. "When the time comes." The words should have felt like a promise, but they carried something else, something restrained, as though the truth he spoke of was not simple, not easy, and not something that could be given without consequence. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for more, for any hint of what lay beneath those carefully chosen words, but he did not offer it, not yet, and slowly, she inclined her head, accepting not the answer, but the reality that whatever she sought would not come easily. He turned then, continuing up the final steps, and she followed, the corridor ahead stretching into a quiet stillness broken only by the faint flicker of candlelight. A door stood open at the far end, warm light spilling into the hall like an invitation. And as she crossed the threshold into the room prepared for her, Emily realized that while she had been given a place in this house, she had not yet been given a place in his truth. And until that moment came, everything around her, every gesture, every word, every silence, would remain only part of a story she was still trying to understand. The door closed softly behind her, and with that single, quiet sound, the world outside seemed to fall away completely, leaving Emily alone in a room that felt both prepared and unfamiliar. The warmth here was different, not the distant heat of the grand hall, but something closer, more contained. A fire burned low in the hearth, its glow casting gentle shadows across the walls, softening the sharp edges of a space that might otherwise have felt overwhelming. She stood still for a moment, not moving further into the room, as if allowing herself to feel the full weight of what had just happened. The silence was no longer filled with whispers or judgment, but it was not empty either. It carried a presence, something quiet and waiting. She removed her gloves slowly, placing them on a small table near the door, her fingers brushing the polished surface as though grounding herself in something tangible. Her reflection caught her attention in a tall mirror across the room, and for a moment she did not recognize the woman staring back. The white dress was still perfect, untouched by the chaos of the day, but everything else had changed. Her eyes held something new, not softness, not innocence, but a quiet resolve shaped by everything she had endured in the span of a single morning. She took a step closer to the mirror, studying that reflection more carefully, as if searching for the girl who had walked into the chapel with a future already decided. But she was gone now, replaced by someone who had chosen a different path, even if she did not yet understand where it would lead. A soft knock at the door broke the stillness, and before she could respond, it opened just enough for a maid to step inside, her posture respectful, her movements careful. "Your Grace." The title still felt unfamiliar, yet it settled into the air as if it had always belonged there. "May I assist you?" Emily hesitated briefly, not because she needed help, but because accepting it meant stepping fully into the role that had been placed upon her. She nodded once, her voice calm. "Yes." The maid moved forward quietly, adjusting the room with practiced ease, setting out fresh linens, arranging small details with precision, as if every movement was part of a larger order that could not be disrupted. Emily watched in silence, her mind drifting back to the conversation in the carriage, to the words he had chosen and the ones he had not. Because no matter how carefully this space had been prepared, it did not answer the question that lingered within her. Why her? Why now? And what truth was he still holding back? The maid finished her work quickly, offering a small bow before leaving as quietly as she had entered. And once again, the room returned to stillness. But this time it felt different, less uncertain, more deliberate, as if it were waiting for her to decide what to do next. Emily moved toward the window, pulling back the heavy curtain just enough to let in the fading light of the afternoon. The ground stretched out below, vast and quiet, the long drive disappearing into the line of trees they had passed earlier, somewhere out there, beyond the estate. Her old life still existed, unchanged and unreachable. And here, within these walls, something entirely new had begun. She rested her hand lightly against the glass, the cool surface a contrast to the warmth behind her. And for the first time since stepping into the carriage, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of the question she had been holding back, not spoken aloud, but impossible to ignore. What had she truly stepped into? And more importantly, what would it demand of her in return? The answer did not come. But as the last light faded and the shadows in the room deepened, she understood one thing with quiet certainty. Whatever truth Alexander Whitmore carried, it was not distant. It was here, somewhere within these walls, waiting, and she would not remain in the dark for long. The last trace of daylight faded from the window, leaving the room wrapped in a quiet, amber glow as the fire in the hearth deepened, its soft crackle the only sound that remained. And Emily stood there a moment longer than necessary, her hand still resting against the cool glass, as if she could hold on to something beyond the walls, something familiar. But there was nothing there now, only distance. Only the quiet certainty that she had stepped into a life that would not release her so easily. She let the curtain fall back into place, the heavy fabric sealing off the outside world, and turned slowly toward the room behind her, the warmth now feeling less like comfort and more like enclosure, not suffocating, but deliberate, as if every detail had been arranged to contain rather than welcome. She moved further inside, her steps softer now, her gaze tracing the edges of the space with more intention, the arrangement of furniture, the careful placement of objects. Everything spoke of preparation, not for her specifically, but for someone who would fit into this role without question, without resistance. And yet she was not that person, not entirely. Her eyes settled on a small writing desk near the far wall, its surface cleared except for a single folded paper placed precisely at its center. The sight of it stilled her for a moment. Something about its presence too intentional to ignore. She approached slowly, each step measured, as if the distance between her and that paper carried more weight than it should. Her fingers hovered above it briefly before lifting it, the texture of the parchment smooth beneath her touch, the seal already broken, as though it had been meant for her to read without ceremony. She unfolded it carefully, her breath steady despite the quiet tension building within her. And as her eyes moved across the words, something shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that would be visible to anyone watching, but deep within her understanding. The letter was brief, written in a precise hand, its message simple yet impossible to dismiss. It spoke not of the day that had just passed, not of the marriage or the scandal or the whispers, but of something older, something that predated all of it, a connection drawn in quiet lines between names she recognized and truth she did not. Her own name among them, written not as a bride or a daughter, but as part of something that had been decided long before she had any say in it. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the paper, the calm she had carried beginning to shift into something sharper, more focused, not fear, but awareness, because this was no longer about what had happened in the chapel. It was about why it had happened at all. A soft sound at the door drew her attention, and she turned just as it opened without waiting for her reply. Alexander stepped inside, his presence filling the space with the same quiet certainty he carried everywhere, his gaze finding her immediately, not surprised to see her standing there, not surprised to see the letter in her hand, as if he had known exactly where she would be and what she would discover. The silence between them stretched, not empty, but charged, and Emily did not lower the paper, did not hide what she had found. Instead, she held his gaze steadily, the question in her eyes no longer unformed, no longer searching, but clear, undeniable. "You knew about this," she said, her voice calm, but no longer soft, because whatever this was, whatever truth had been placed in her hands, it was no longer something she would wait to understand. And for the first time since he had stepped into her life, Alexander did not answer immediately. The pause longer, heavier, as if the moment she had reached had always been inevitable, and now there was no path forward that did not require the truth. Alexander's silence did not feel like hesitation. It felt like weight, the kind that settles in the space between two people when something long hidden can no longer remain untouched. His gaze did not leave hers, but there was a shift in it now, something less guarded, more exposed. As if the carefully controlled distance he had maintained until this moment had begun to fracture under the truth she now held in her hands. Emily did not move. The letter still open between her fingers, its presence no longer just a question but a demand, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the calm detachment she had grown accustomed to. Instead, it held something quieter, something far more personal. "Yes," he said, and the single word settled heavily into the room. Undeniable, unsoftened, her breath remained steady, but something within her tightened, not in shock, because she had already known, but in confirmation, because knowing and hearing it spoken were not the same. "How long?" she asked, her voice even, though the question carried more weight than its simplicity suggested, because this was no longer about a single decision made in a chapel. It was about time, about intention, about a truth that had been unfolding without her awareness. Alexander stepped further into the room, the door closing quietly behind him as if sealing them into this moment. His eyes did not waver, but the answer did not come immediately, and when it did, it was measured, deliberate. "Long enough," he replied, and though the words were controlled, they carried an honesty that could not be mistaken. Emily lowered her gaze briefly to the letter again, the names, the connections, the quiet lines that had tied her life to something far larger than she had ever been told, and when she looked back at him, there was no confusion left in her expression, only clarity, sharp and unwavering. "Then this was never about saving me," she said, not accusing, not bitter, but certain, because the truth had shifted the ground beneath her feet. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign that her words had struck something real. "No," he said again. But this time the word did not carry the same quiet certainty as before. It carried conflict, something unresolved, and he took another step closer, closing the distance between them just enough that the space felt smaller, more immediate. It was about not letting history repeat itself, he continued, and the weight of that statement lingered, heavy with meaning. Emily's gaze sharpened, because this was the first time he had spoken of something beyond her, beyond the present moment, something rooted in a past she had not yet seen. "What history?" she asked, and this time her voice was not soft. It was steady, demanding, because whatever had brought him to that chapel, whatever had led him to intervene, it was not coincidence, it was not impulse, it was something far deeper, and she would not remain outside of it any longer. Alexander exhaled slowly, as if the answer itself required him to step beyond the boundaries he had set for himself. His eyes shifted briefly, not away from her, but toward something unseen, something remembered, and when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but heavier. "Your mother," he said, and the name hung in the air like a key turning in a lock. Emily's breath stilled, not because of the mention itself, but because of the way he said it, not as a distant reference, but as something known, something personal, and in that moment, the truth shifted again, expanding beyond her, beyond the present, into something that reached further back than she had ever imagined. And as the silence settled between them once more, it was no longer filled with questions of what had happened, but with the realization that everything she thought she understood about her life had only been the surface, and the truth waiting beneath it was only just beginning to reveal itself. The name lingered in the air long after he spoke it, as if the room itself had recognized its weight, and Emily felt something shift beneath her carefully held composure, not breaking, but deepening, because this was no longer a question of coincidence or convenience. This was something rooted in a past she had never been allowed to fully see. Her fingers slowly lowered the letter, though she did not release it, as if it were the only solid proof that what she was hearing was real. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than before, but steadier. "You knew her." It was not a question, not anymore, and Alexander did not deny it, his gaze holding hers with a gravity that left no room for evasion. "I did," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke that stripped away the distance he had maintained until now. Not formal, not detached, but personal in a way that changed everything. Emily took a slow breath, the pieces beginning to form a pattern she had not seen before. Then this was never just about me, she said. And though her words carried clarity, they were not cold. They were searching, trying to understand the shape of a truth that was still unfolding. Alexander stepped closer, not enough to invade her space, but enough to make the moment feel more immediate, more real. It is about you, he said quietly, and for the first time, there was no restraint in his voice, only certainty. But not only you. The distinction settled between them, fragile but undeniable. Emily's gaze did not waver, even as something within her tightened, not in fear, but in recognition of what that meant, because whatever had connected him to her mother had not ended. It had carried forward, shaped decisions, shaped moments, shaped the path that had led them both here. What happened to her? She asked, the question finally breaking through everything else. Because if the past had brought them together, then it held answers she could no longer ignore. Alexander's expression changed then, not dramatically, but enough for her to see it. The faintest shadow crossing his features, not of regret, not entirely, but of memory. And when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet weight. She stood where you stood, he said, and the words struck deeper than any explanation could have, because Emily understood immediately what he meant. The chapel, the silence, the moment where everything could be lost in a single breath, and no one stepped forward. He continued, and the absence in those words filled the room more completely than any presence could. Emily's breath caught, not from shock, but from the sudden clarity of it, the realization that what had happened to her had not been unique. It had been repeated, a pattern she had unknowingly stepped into, and that he had chosen to break, not because of impulse, not because of obligation, but because he had seen it before and refused to let it happen again. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with everything that had not been said for years, everything that had led to this moment. Emily looked at him, really looked, seeing now not just the man who had stepped into the chapel, but the reason he had done so, the past that had shaped him, the choice that had not been as sudden as it had seemed. And slowly, something within her shifted, not into trust, not yet, but into understanding, the first fragile step towards something that might become it. She lowered the letter fully now, placing it carefully on the desk beside her, as if acknowledging that it had done its work, that the truth it carried had already changed everything. You could have told me, she said softly, not accusing, but honest, because the truth had been there all along, just out of reach. Alexander's gaze held hers, unwavering. And you would have believed me, he asked, and there was no challenge in his tone, only a quiet question, one that did not demand an answer, because they both knew the truth of it. Emily did not respond, because she could not, because the answer was already there, and as the firelight flickered softly around them, casting shadows that moved and shifted but never disappeared, she realized that whatever had begun between them was not built on chance, not built on illusion, but on something far more complicated, something rooted in past and choice and the quiet, unspoken need to change what had once been left undone. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, though the answers were not yet complete, one truth had settled into place with quiet certainty. Some moments are not meant to be endured alone, and some choices are made not for love, but for the chance to rewrite what was once lost.